All right, so I have about an hour or so to talk with you about something which is really fond and dear to my heart, which is non-suicidal self-injury. We all have our quirks. But before I start, there were a couple things that I wanted to address. We've been talking a lot about borderline personality disorder. It's something of great interest to us. And I was reminded, and I actually told some of my colleagues this story. About 10 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that now, John Gunderson, one of the world's leaders in borderline personality disorder, asked me to come and speak to a group of parents about borderline personality disorder. And he introduced me, and he said, I have to tell you, I have no idea how you determine whether an adolescent has borderline personality disorder or not, since all of them seem to look like they have borderline personality disorder. Let me just tell you that has never been my experience. My experience is that we can tell and have been able to tell for quite some time that adolescents, you can diagnose borderline personality in adolescents, no problem. The one place I would say that it gets a little bit confusing is in early adolescence. 13, 14, and sometimes 15. It's a little bit harder there because you're going to have a more emotional ability. But even with that, you can do this. Okay, so I got interested in kids who are hurting themselves this way. In my first year of my postdoc at McLean, in an adolescent program, I overheard two girls talking about burning themselves. And what was incredibly surprising to me is that neither one of them spoke about the pain. What they did speak about was how much better they felt after they did it. And I thought, not having burned myself too many times in my life, but having burned myself on occasion, that would not have been my experience of being burned. Just would not have happened. And I got incredibly curious about this. And so I just began to see as many kids who were self-injuring as was possible. And so in many ways, what I'm going to tell you today, I learned from my patients. All right, now, in the back, or if I start dropping the microphone, raise your hand, let me know, and I'll do something about it. Just don't get mad at me. Or get mad at me and just notice that you've gotten mad at me. Okay. So, non-suicidal self-injury, the definition of this is it's deliberate injury to one's body without the intention of dying. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean that kids don't do things that they don't intend to kill themselves but could kill themselves. Okay? But it's what's in the person's mind. If I did not intend to die, and I damage myself, that's non-suicidal self-injury. If I intend to die, it's suicide. Okay? Now, this is a rather arbitrary definition and not really, in some ways, so terribly important. What is important is that this behavior has a very strong positive correlation with completed suicides. So it is a behavior that really needs to be addressed and addressed early. Now, I didn't know this in the beginning when I first got interested in non-suicidal self-injury. And so I would find myself, I knew the kids weren't trying to kill themselves because they told me they weren't trying to kill themselves. They were just trying to make themselves feel better. So I would tell parents this really heartening thing. I would say, we're going to get the kid to stop self-injuring until right after we solve all of their other problems. Once we do that, the self-injury is going to disappear. Well, I would like you to know that yes, you can treat people that way. It takes almost forever. But you can treat self-injury by treating every other problem around it. It is not my recommendation. One of the things that very quickly drew me to DBT is that it is actually a targeted treatment, and a high priority target is non-suicidal self-injury, in part because of its link to completed suicides. I mean, there's some evidence that you're like 9 times more likely to die by suicide if you have a history of non-suicidal self-injury, which in some ways makes sense because even though your intention is not to die, you're actually practicing on the way to suicide. You've crossed the boundary and now you are harming yourself. And certainly non-suicidal self-injury has some real damaging effects on current and future relationships. Now, the problem with adolescence is talking about the future because adolescent time sense is often bimodal. And by that I mean now is when I want my iPhone. Now is when I want to go to the mall. Later is when I'm going to clean my room, which borders on in the neighborhood of never, right? So when you start thinking about trying to talk with a kid about things in the future, you need to keep in mind that you are not talking the same language, right? But what is so terribly true about non-suicidal self-injury is that it is a very effective short-term solution. That is, you feel better instantly. It is a lousy solution to long-term problems. And that, to me, is the message that needs to get across to the kids. Yes, this works in the short run, but it actually keeps you stuck in your life. Okay, so where have we been around this issue of non-suicidal self-injury? When I first got to McLean Hospital in 1979, which does seem like a long time ago now, I have to tell you, anytime a kid cut themselves, we put them in the hospital because we assumed they were suicidal. Didn't make any difference in fact they were telling us that they were not suicidal. We just knew better than they did. So it was very difficult to examine this behavior when it was conflated with suicidal behavior. Right? We've sort of separated those two behaviors out. And while some folks think this is not true, this has really been part and parcel of my experience. If you ask your patient, did you intend to kill yourself or not? Most often they'll be able to tell you whether their intention was to kill themselves or to feel better. So ask the question, okay? Just really ask the question. The reason I raise this is that I had a conversation with the treatment developer, one of the treatment developers for mentalization-based treatment, and he was very, very clear, no, you can't ask people these questions because they can't differentiate between suicide and self-injury. And that's just not been my experience. So get your own experience about that one. All right, the common forms of non-suicidal self-injury. The leading way that people self-injure is by cutting. Okay? And it probably doesn't to get the relief from hurting yourself, you do not have to cut yourself deeply. There is very little evidence that how deeply you cut actually makes any difference in getting the emotional relief that comes with this behavior. Then we find kids who are burning themselves, scratching themselves, some forms of skin picking. When it comes to skin picking, you really do have to make an assessment. Is this more an OCD behavior, or is this more in the service of emotion regulation? It's not an easy thing to tease out, but it's really important that you do that because in some ways there are two different routes to treatment here. And then there are people who break their bones deliberately. Take a hammer, smash it on their wrists, break their legs, their knees. It's really, really something. Okay, so those are the more common forms. There is some little bit of evidence that boys punch walls in the service of emotion regulation. I think we just don't know enough about boys just yet to be able to really speak to this. Okay, I put this slide in because parents are always asking me this question. Do tattoos count as self-injury? I think personally it's a mental illness to have a tattoo, but I'm an old guy. So And my son is entirely, like, he's got tattoos all over the place. He paid for them himself, let me assure you about that. So tattoos are not an SSI unless you decide you're going to tattoo yourself right after you've had a fight with somebody and you want to feel better. Okay? Then it meets that criteria. Same thing with piercings. Piercings are not non-suicidal self-injury unless I pierce myself as a way of seeking emotional relief. Substance abuse is not non-suicidal self-injury. I do not recommend substance abuse, but it doesn't meet criteria for non-suicidal self-injury. In the same way that eating disorder behavior is often not non-suicidal self-injury, although it can have similar function to non-suicidal self-injury. Okay? So, as I say, I put this slide on because parents are often asking this question, and now you can say, you know, you went to a conference and no, that don't count. All right. So these are somewhat old statistics about the prevalence of the problem, and my guess is they're about, if anything, the prevalence has increased. All right. So we know that there are, you know, community samples that look like anywhere between 14 and 18% of high school students will engage in non-suicidal self-injury, at least have one episode in their lives. There are young people out there who only cut themselves once and never do it again. They are rare. Oftentimes, once you start, you're going to continue doing this because as a behavior to get yourself regulated, it works. I just want to tell you, it works better than anything else we have. So you need to be able to validate the wisdom of your patient's self-injury. If you can't validate the wisdom of your patient's non-suicidal self-injury, it's going to be tough to treat that. And I'll say a little bit more about that. So 14 to 18% of high school students. This, I think that in terms of university students, the range here it needs to be really looked at again. But anywhere between 12 and 35% of college students in America have engaged in non-suicidal self-injury at least once in the time. Okay, the age of onset is 11 to 14, but in the last couple of days I've read a paper that looked at a community sample. This is not a clinic sample. This is a community sample of kids who are self-injuring, and they looked at kids 7 to I think 11 or 12, and about 7%, almost 8% of the very young kids had engaged in non-suicidal self-injury. And then, interestingly enough, with mid-range, it drops a little bit and then spikes around the very beginning of high school. Okay, so what we're finding is that the age of onset of this problem is getting lower and lower and lower. I met someone once who began self-injuring at 9, but I think for you people just entering into the clinical field, you're going to find that you're going to see kids who are doing this much, much younger. We have some evidence that boys and girls self-injure at about the same rate in community samples, although girls are much more overrepresented in clinic samples. Okay, so girls are showing up for treatment more than boys are showing up for treatment. I believe that will change and is changing over time. We'll see that this is probably going to even out a little bit more. So who are these people? Who are these kids that are doing this? So Armida broke down these 5 categories, and in a sense they map really well onto self-injurers. As a group, they are more emotionally sensitive. That is, they feel things more intensely than most people. They feel things more immediately than most people, even if they cannot accurately label the feeling they're having. They know they're feeling something, and you get all sorts of nondescript kinds of words: freaking out, overwhelmed, all these kinds of really non-behaviorally precise words. Right? They have, and they are people who take longer to get back to baseline. Now, we're not sure if it's why it takes longer to get back to baseline. That is, do they get more upset than most people, so it just takes longer to travel back down? Or are their physiologic systems such that it just takes them longer to get down to baseline? Alternatively, these kids may be very difficult to read emotionally. That is, you cannot get anything from their face. You cannot tell what the person is feeling. They can be quite good at masking their emotions. But a little bit of a secret here is actually nobody can do that really, really 100%. Nobody can actually mask their emotions all that well. It's just that it may appear on the emotion may appear on their face for just a split second. So my advice to people I supervise who have these kinds of patients is to pay attention to the area right around the eyes. Because if you pay attention to the area around the eyes, you will more likely be able to read the emotion that the person is having. They are, as a group, incredibly self-critical and self-invalidating. All right. So, is it getting warm in here? I see a lot of fans going on. Should we ask for a heat check? Can we have a heat check here? Well, what can I say? We're all going to have to use our distress tolerance skills. Here. All right. So there are a couple of neurobiologic mechanisms that are postulated to be the mediators for this behavior. One is, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but at the time of tissue damage, there are opiate-like endorphins that are released into the bloodstream. There is some evidence that these free-floating opioids that some people with borderline personality disorder have less of these, and so that the self-injury actually increases the doses of opiate-like endorphins into one's bloodstream. Now, if you put opiates in your bloodstream, you are going to calm down. There's no two ways about it. So that is one theory. Then there's another theory that has been around actually for a long time, but not actually targeted to non-suicidal self-injury, and this is called pain offset theory. And in short, I'll try to explain it to you, but it's so complicated that I sometimes get a nosebleed when I try to walk myself through it. But basically, I don't know if this translates to Latin cultures, but sometimes in the States we'll say, you know the story about the man who was banging his head against the wall, and his friend says, "Why are you banging your head against the wall?" And he says, "Well, it feels so good when I stop." This actually is pain offset theory. It turns out that when you hurt yourself, soon after hurting yourself, you can find a place. Oh, thank you. You will become calmer than your usual baseline. So that what I want to bring home to you is that self-injury can both be negatively reinforced. That is what the opiate mechanism is doing. That is, I'm in a state of high emotional distress. I cut myself. I feel better. I've now reinforced self-injury. Right? It's negative reinforcement. If you feel better better than you usually do after you self-injured, that's going to be more of a positive reinforcement. Whatever it is, what you have to keep in mind is that all of this behavior is experienced by the human being, so it transacts with their core beliefs. And this becomes especially important when you have someone who says they cut themselves as a way of being punished. Okay? Which a lot of young people will tell you, I do this as a way of being punished. And of course it doesn't meet any of the criterion for punishment. Okay? But in my mind, I feel like I've paid my dues because I've now cut myself, which is kind of interesting because usually when we think of punishment, we think of something that's somehow painful or moderately painful, where about 40% of people who self-injure do not feel any pain at the time of self-injury. Now, we have a tiny bit of evidence that self-injurers have a higher pain tolerance than quote-unquote normals, and we have a little bit of evidence that you can actually change someone's capacity to tolerate pain. Jill Hooley at Harvard recently did a study where she took self-injurers and she ran them through a number of tests and determined that they actually, a lot of these young people had pretty robust capacities to withstand pain. But then she was able to, in a short interview, to change the person's view of themselves to a more benign view. That is, they saw themselves as often a little more kind, a little more empathic. And then when they were put through the test about self-injury, they could not tolerate the painful situation as long as they had before the interview. So I don't know if I'm being clear here because it's getting hot, but the fact of the matter is that so much of self-injury is influenced by how we think about ourselves, which in part is our job, is to sort of get a sense of how and why the person thinks of themselves in the way they do, and then how are we going to shift this? And that's where the skill set and DBT really do come in. Okay. So the biggest thing that I want you to, if you don't get anything else from my talk today, just please remember that what you and the parents see as the problem, self-injury, your patient sees as the solution. Okay? So where you think self-injury is a problem, they're thinking, are you kidding me? I have just found the world's greatest solution to making myself feel better. I can do it instantly. I can do it in ways where no one's going to really find out about it. And if you're not on the same page, you're not going to be able to do treatment. So if you think about, for lack of a better word, crazy behavior is only crazy as long as you don't understand it. Once you understand crazy behavior, whatever that crazy behavior is, it starts to make sense. Now, I've been doing this work for about 40 years now, and I can certainly tell you, in my early years as a psychodynamic therapist, I actually did think some things were crazy and irrational. As I've gotten older and had more life experience and became more of a behaviorist, turns out that there isn't a behavior that I've heard about that doesn't make sense to me if I were that person in that circumstance. And so that's really I think the best way to think about this. And as I said earlier, you must be able to communicate your understanding and the wisdom in the person's self-injuring behavior really before you're going to be able to treat it. Otherwise, you're going to get kind of phony non-compliance. Yeah, doc. Yeah, I'm really going to stop that. Yeah. Or you're just going to have a fight. Because the person's going to say, it's my body. I can do what I want with it. Okay. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right. So let's talk a little bit about assessing non-suicidal self-injury. Well, the first thing you need to assess is, was this a suicide attempt or not? All right. Then you, as I said, you could just ask the question. I mean, really, that's not any fancier than that. Just ask the question: did you think about killing yourself or not? Then we need to know that. And while, just to digress for a second, while I'm doing my assessment about self-injury, I'm also doing a lot of psychoeducation about self-injury to the patient. about what they're trying to do, how it works, what the problem is with maintaining the behavior, what the upside is of maintaining the behavior. Because all behavior has consequences. Not all of the consequences of self-injury are negative. Most of them are. And the ones that are, I think, negative are more enduring. But I was feeling really jumping out of my skin crazy, and I cut myself and I feel better, and that took 3 minutes. Hard to argue with that as not an effective and efficient way of managing one's emotions. Okay, so we're gonna start looking at the function of self-injury. Okay? When I was first became a psychologist, we rarely looked at the function of anything. What we looked at was the meaning of something. Now, let me tell you, as human beings, we are masters at making shit up. I'm just going to tell you. We are great at it. And not only are we good at making it up, we actually believe it. Wholeheartedly. Okay. So, but as a behaviorist, my first thing is to look at what's the function of this behavior. How is this behavior working to keep the person regulated and on balance? So the primary, most usual way of the function of self-injury is down-regulating emotional experience. So I'm jumping out of my skin, I have no idea, I can't think straight, my hair's on fire, I'm running around, I don't know what to do, I cut myself, I feel better, my emotions get down-regulated. Okay, this is very much a negative reinforcement paradigm. Then there are a group of people who need to up-regulate their emotions. That is, they are forever feeling numb and empty, bored, which does translate often to lonely. And it is not, as the song used to be, comfortably numb. It is uncomfortably numb, painfully numb. It is an aversive state that you want to escape. And it turns out that if you cut yourself, you start to regain your sense of feeling. And you're back in the world again and present. And so that is the second largest category of self-injurers. The third largest group of self-injurers, and now we're talking about a very small group of kids, use self-injury as avoidance. So something is coming up, and these categories, of course, overlap, but something's coming up, I'm becoming increasingly worried about what I have to do. I cut myself, and then everything, the train now is forgetting about what I have to do, but how am I going to get taken care of? I'm on my way to the emergency room rather than taking my math test. So avoidance is a function of self-injury. And then, thank goodness for this one. There are a few kids out there who self-injure as a way of getting attention. This is the smallest group of kids. Okay? And when I first became interested in non-suicidal self-injury, attention-seeking was the one thing that most everybody stated as the reason about why their kid was self-injuring. And it just stopped making sense to me pretty quickly, because most of the time, self-injurers hide their self-injury. Now, I just want to ask you, if you were going to do something for attention, would you hide it? It doesn't make any sense, right? Okay. So, attention-seeking is the least endorsed reason by self-injurers for the reasons that they cut. The emotion regulation is the top one. Fortunately now, parents and clinicians are on top of this, and rarely do they say, she's doing this or he's doing this just to get my attention. Okay, but it does happen. All right. Now, when we're looking at assessing and thinking about self-injury, we have to figure out what are the controlling variables about self-injury. What happened, okay? So it can be operantly controlled, that is at the back end, which is what the positive reinforcement and the negative reinforcement, this is all operantly controlled. But self-injury can also be responded, that is, it can be controlled by the stimuli. So I ran a generic adolescent program for a while.